unabridged reading of Beyond the War of Thorns, Chapter 2, Part 3. Underneath the blue and purple hues of the majestic Ashenvale oak trees, and at the base of the red rocky Stone Talon Mountains, 5 figures cautiously made their way west. Weary from the battle they had engaged in moments ago, these individuals breathed a sigh of relief as they reached their destination at the foot of the mountain. "Is the coast clear?" shouted Kando Shatterpath as he and his companions stood waiting in front of a large pile of rocks and boulders. "I see squirrels, some deer and some birds," responded Shin Yodapan, who had gracefully climbed and hopped his way up a gigantic tree and was now looking out towards the Ashenvale landscape. "I think we're safe." "Okay, Hina," said Kando as he turned towards the young shaman. After nodding in acknowledgement, Hina Wolf Cloudweaver turned to the side of the mountain and began to speak. "We have returned, Sebi," said the young Tauren in a gentle voice. "Please allow us to enter our home, old friend." With her words, the rocks and boulders in front of her began to vibrate and move. A strange force then started to arrange the items one on top of another until the boulders began to form a figure. After a few more seconds, the process was complete, resulting in a large and powerful earth elemental standing before the group. While not having legs, this being was maintained upright by powerful winds, had massive, broad granite shoulders, had large, imposing hands made of rock, and used one exceedingly hefty boulder as a head. Finally, Tsebi opened its eyes, revealing 2 magma-infused orbs with which it gazed at the rebels. "Hello, Tsebi," said Hina, while smiling and waving joyfully at the elemental construct. After taking a second to examine the group, Tsebi shuffled to the side, revealing a hidden cave entrance. "Here we go," thought Lao Yodapan, as the rest of the group walked towards the elemental. When Hina had first summoned Tsebi, the giant construct had mistaken Lao, Shin and Kando for enemies, and after inflicting some bumps and bruises on the 3 rebels, the elemental was finally brought under control by the young shaman with the help of her grandfather, Achak Cloudweaver. "Easy does it," whispered Kando under his breath as he maintained his battle axe firmly in hand, and while he maintained visual contact with Tsebi at all times. One by one the rebels entered the cave, and when all were inside, the earth elemental returned to its post. After closing its eyes, the powers that had given life to Tsebi suddenly vanished, and the elemental's body quickly collapsed back into a large pile of boulders and rocks, closing off the cave entrance. Kando, Lao and Shin breathed a sigh of relief. Inside the cave entrance, a large series of passages, subterranean rivers and unique flora stood before the rebels. As the group traversed these caverns, strange glowing fungi seemed to come alive and illuminate the way for them. In addition, the 2 Tauren shaman had set up several small, ever-burning totems that would lead the rebels to their hideout. The group had walked over a couple of land bridges and had covered dozens of yards of caverns when Hina noticed Kando still had a look of frustration on his face. "What's wrong, Kando?" asked Hina as she leaned in to whisper, ensuring that the others could not hear their conversation. "Well, I," responded Kando, somewhat surprised by the young shaman's question. "Don't worry for me, Hina, I'm fine," said the warrior, after taking a second to compose himself and attempt to appear relaxed. "I see," said Hina, her face showing that she was clearly not content with her companion's answer. "Kando," she added, "I've only known you for a short while, but you are quite easy to read. Tell me what's wrong, and while I might not be able to help, maybe just talking about it could help ease your spirit." "It's nothing, Hina," continued the warrior. "Please, Kando." The large Tauren was slightly taken aback by Hina's persistence, but after seeing that she would not relent, he decided to confess his troubles to her. "I had known Iero throughout my youth," said Kando, "and so I hoped I could make him see reason. Instead, he escaped, and now our enemies are aware of our efforts. My foolish kindness has put my friends at risk once again." He finished, as his face once again depicted the anger and frustration he truly felt inside. "I'm glad you haven't lost your kind spirit, Kando," responded Hina, after thinking over her companion's words for a couple of seconds. That kindness is what separates us from them, so hold on to it. Our people need warriors like you, Kando, finished the young shaman while placing her hand on Kando's arm. Thank you, Hina, said Kando. Your words renew me, he added. And while it was true, Hina's gentleness and kind words did bring peace back to him. His warrior's spirit knew what needed to be done when next he met Iero. And look on the bright side, Kando, continued Hina. Our enemies have no idea where or how to find us. That is true, responded Kando. Your elemental servant is quite useful. I find your control over it to be quite amazing, young Hina. The warrior's overall mood had now brightened thanks to the female's words and positive demeanor, but Hina's next comments were sure to shock him. Something the young shaman's playful nature would surely find entertaining. You know, she said, you'll have to learn to control Sebi too, Kando. I leave for Mulgore tomorrow, so you'll have to be able to open the cave entrance on your own. What? Responded the startled warrior. I'm sure your grandfather will be able to help us with the elemental while you're gone, Hina, he added, while having flashbacks to when Sebi sent him flying with one powerful blow with its giant rock fist. My grandfather is old, said Hina. He won't be able to go on every excursion with you. Plus, I'll make sure to instruct Sebi to obey you before I go. You'll only have to say its name and you'll be granted access to the cave entrance. I promise it'll go easy on you next time, she finished with a light chuckle. Very well, Hina, responded Kando while chuckling as well. Say, he added in an attempt to change the subject, I just noticed the trinket hanging from your neck. It glows with power as we walk through the dark areas in these caverns. It's my Ankh of Resurrection, said Hina, as she grabbed the object and held it up in front of her. The metallic trinket was shaped like a small cross in which the 4 bars became wider towards the ends. As Kando noted, the Ankh would occasionally emit a blue glow when they were completely surrounded by darkness. It's been passed down from generation to generation in my family, continued Hina. It's said to have the power to bring the bearer back to life. Sadly, it did not work for my father, she finished as her demeanor became solemn. I'm sorry, Hina, I fumbled the warrior, as he realized he had touched a sensitive subject. It's all right, Kando, she assured him, once again smiling at her companion. His spirit is at rest, and I'm sure I'll see him again, along with all of my ancestors. Yes, you will, responded Kando as he smiled back at Hina. The group of rebels then continued to traverse the multiple caverns beneath the Stone Talon Mountains' rugged terrain. After several more minutes, an opening filled with bright yellowish light appeared in the darkness, not too far in the distance. As the group approached the light and subsequently stepped through this entrance, they were greeted by the beauty and splendor of the cave they currently called home. This subterranean hideout housed more of the peculiar flora encountered throughout the caverns. Its many stalagmites and rocky formations had been decorated with Shuhalo figures and artifacts. Several giant totems reinforced the cave at key locations. On one of the edges, a quickly flowing river provided the inhabitants with an unlimited supply of fresh water. And at the center of the cave stood a sizable teepee covered in animal skins, countless eagle feathers, and more Tauren imagery and trinkets. Additionally, a powerful, ever-burning totem at the center provided warmth and proper illumination, and several other smaller totems lined the edges of the vast cave, ensuring that nearly every nook and cranny was well lit. Hina, said Lao as the group began to settle in, if I could trouble you to start a cooking fire for me, I'll be able to prepare a meal for the group that is sure to grant us a good night's rest. A batch of my famous spicy vegetable chips, half not too spicy for those with more delicate tastes, and a pot of hot valerian tea are sure to relax any troubled mind while not being too difficult to digest. Sure, Lao, said Hina cheerfully. I'll get right on it. And I'll help, added Kando as he made his way to a pile of firewood. Within a couple of minutes, The rebels had changed into more comfortable clothes and had huddled around the campfire to enjoy a well-earned meal. With bellies filled and spirits reinvigorated, the five were ready for some much-needed rest, but not before a few last-minute checkups were finalized, as Hina had an important and lengthy trip to embark on the next day. She would be heading to a hidden camp housing many civilian defectors in northern Mulgore to retrieve supplies and any valuable information available. "As you are to depart tomorrow, granddaughter," spoke up Achak, "I would remind you once more to ensure that you stay on the roads. I know that you are very familiar with the Stone Talon Mountains, Hina, but this is your first time traveling alone, and I'll be safe, grandfather," responded Hina. "And remember to stay clear of any Sylvanas loyalists." "Yes, grandfather. If there is any sign of trouble, immediately turn around and see." "Grandfather?" Hina finally responded in a slightly more irritated tone. "We've been over this. Don't worry, my powers have grown exponentially these last few weeks, and I probably won't have to use them anyway. Remember," she continued as she drew closer to Achak and gently grabbed the old Tauren's hand, "I am the only one in our group that the Sylvanas loyalists have not seen, which is why I'm the perfect choice to make this trip." Iero might have seen her, thought Kando, who was standing several yards away but could overhear the shaman's conversation. Hina was never close to the loyalist Tauren, but the off chance that Iero could remember her appearance from seeing her in the distance was not something that sat well with Kando. Regardless, there was nothing he could do now, and Hina was still clearly the member of the group with the lowest profile. "Forgive an old Tauren," said Achak as he gave Hina a firm hug, "but you are all I have left after your parents." "You are right though, Hina," added the old Tauren. "You have grown quite strong. You make your ancestors proud." "Thank you, grandfather," added Hina as she hugged him back, tears now welling up in her eyes. "I hope I'm not interrupting," interjected Lao as he approached holding a small, rolled-up parchment. "No," responded the young Tauren while wiping tears from her cheek. "It's fine, Lao." "I understand you will be departing quite early tomorrow, Hina," continued the Pandaren, "so I wanted to give you my list before going to bed. I'm quite tired, and there's no guarantee that I'll see you in the morning," he added with a chuckle. "I know you will not be visiting Thunderbluff, but hopefully you'll find some of these items at the rebel village. I sure could use some jade lungfish and reef octopus," he finished as he handed over the parchment to the shaman. "I'll see what I can do," responded Hina as she placed the list in her pocket. "If anything, I'm sure The young shaman was suddenly distracted by noises coming from several yards away. "Is Shin actually training at this hour?" Indeed, Shin had resumed training at the other side of the cave where the two monks had set up their living quarters. This corner had floor mats for sleeping, a meditation zone surrounded by incense plates, and a larger mat for combat practice and sparring. This section was also, as to be expected, decorated with a vast array of Pandaren figures and paintings, including two prominent statues on opposite sides, one of a black ox and one of a white tiger. "Ah, yes," said Lao, while turning to see his cousin kicking, punching, jumping and more at the other side of the cave. "He is a Pandaren on a mission, but I'm sure he'll settle down within an hour. As for me," added the monk as he turned back towards the shamans, "I bid you both a good night's rest, and may you have a productive and uneventful trip, Hina." "Thank you, Lao," responded Hina with a subtle bow. "And good night to you as well." "Good night, friend," added Achak. And the group of rebels then headed off to their sleeping arrangements. Shin, however, only intensified his training more and more as the minutes passed. "You think I'm a slow, clumsy, fat oaf, do you?" thought the Pandaren as he dashed forward a short distance and punched fiercely into the air. "You humiliated me and left me for dead," he thought as he flipped through the air, kicking upwards in a crescent shape. "You had your chance to kill me," he whispered under his breath as he rolled backwards and landed on his feet. "You should have made sure I was dead," he continued, while rotating his hands around one another in a circular pattern. "You made a mistake in letting me live," the monk whispered to himself as he brought his right hand up in front of him, extending his thumb, index finger, and middle finger. "A mistake you'll pay for with your life," he finished as red, glowing energy briefly swirled around his three extended fingers. Many of Sylvanus' loyalists had found their end in the shadowy forests of Darkshore over the last 2 days. Drydara Wildhunt and her night elf companions had used their knowledge of the environment to their advantage, and even large groups of soldiers had stood no chance against them. The 4 Kaldorei now prowled the southern reaches of the territory, stealthily searching for their next victims. Despite this group's familiarity with war and violence, though, nothing had prepared them for the battle they would soon be engaged in, or who they would have to fight. "I recognize him," said Kalindra Swiftwing as she kneeled next to a night elf corpse they had just happened upon on the forest floor. "He was with a group that headed south just minutes before we did. I have several friends in that group," she continued while attempting to hide the sense of dread now coursing through her mind. The Kaldori's body had been horribly disfigured, and much of him had multiple bite marks. In addition, the remains were emitting an unnaturally putrid smell, not typical of even a rotten corpse. "The footprints lead further south," said Drydara, magically transmitting her voice to her companions despite being in her feral form. "The stench of horde is in the air, and I believe we will find our prey in the Grove of the Ancients." The 4 nodded in agreement and continued their march south. Drydara stalked the forests as a ferocious night saber. Kalindra moved swiftly with her bow in hand and her warden owl by her side. Jaffron Alphastar followed further behind, also transformed into a feral night saber, albeit a smaller and less imposing one than Drydara, and Geridus Alphastar watched from the skies, transformed into a majestic lunar-wing owl. "I see them," echoed Geridus's words in his companions' minds, as the druid had been the first to spot the gruesome scene from up above. While the eldest Alphastar's avian form was anything but inconspicuous, with its large size, vibrant purple feathers, crown-like antlers, golden armor pieces, and many Kaldorei trinkets and decorations, he had maintained himself at a safe distance far above the treetops. Still, even from that height he could see the countless number of corpses of his brethren, as well as the 3 Forsaken soldiers cannibalizing them, and the additional orc and troll that stood guard. Several fallen ancient protectors were also strewn around the grove, their wooden frames broken into pieces and burning brightly below the night sky. "Ashkarath!" Drydara's voice echoed through the Kaldorei's minds. "Kill them all," she added as she wildly charged behind one of the Forsaken. Her movements were so swift that the undead had no time to react before the feral druid ripped out its spinal cord. "To arms!" yelled the orc as he unsheathed his battle axe. But before he could strike Drydara, Luna swept in from behind and snatched the soldier's weapon away. The orc's confused face was subsequently wiped away as Kalindra's arrow shot through his heart. Before any of the other horde soldiers had time to react, the earth began to shake beneath their feet as Jaffron had shifted his form into that of a monstrous bear and was now charging at them. "Let fire come due!" One of the remaining Forsaken soldiers was unable to cast her spell before Jaffron bashed her skull with his giant paw. Before the undead could recover, she found herself viciously mauled to pieces by the raging beast. "Die, monster!" shouted the troll as she launched several throwing axes at the giant Bruin, to no avail. The projectiles simply bounced off Jaffron's impossibly thick fur. "We are the monsters?" asked Geridus as he dove down from the sky and quickly transformed back into his original night elf form. "You say this as you butcher our people and destroy our homes," he continued, while he called down a giant blast of starfire on the troll. The Sylvanas loyalist's body was then ripped in two, as a bright flash of light illuminated the surrounding forests momentarily. "Geridas!" yelled Jaffron, as the last Forsaken soldier had stealthily maneuvered behind the eldest Alpha Star and was now lunging at the Kaldorei, daggers in hand. Before the undead could strike, though, Dryadara dashed at the rogue and decapitated him mid-air with a brutal slash. With the 5 murderous scoundrels now dead, the 4 Kaldori took a moment to mourn over their fallen brothers and sisters. Dryadara and Jaffron shifted back into their night elf forms, and Kalindra and Geridas joined them in silent prayer. "We must give our people a proper burial," Dryadara spoke up after a couple of minutes had passed. "They deserve better than..." The night elf stopped mid-sentence, as something strange caught her eye. The druid knelt down next to one of the Kaldorei corpses and began to examine the fletching on the arrow that had finished off her kinsman. "What's the matter?" asked Jaffron while approaching from behind. "This arrow," responded Dryadara as she ran her fingers down the projectile's shaft. "I recognize the markings and the fletching. These were used by one of our people's butchers, by one of Sylvanas's most lethal and vile Dark Rangers." Unbeknownst to the group of Kaldori, as they gathered around the druid to listen to her words, a dark, shadowy figure watched from the treetops. "So you recognize my arrows, do you, little night elf?" thought Valdira duskily, as her eyes glowed with a haunting red glow. "If so, I wonder if you'll know what happens next." "If what you say is true," continued Jaffron on the forest floor, "then we must hunt this monster down and make sure she never harms our people again." "Yes, brother," responded Dryadara as she stood back up, gritting her teeth, and gazed out at the forests to the south. "We will track that witch down and..." The night elf was suddenly interrupted as the cold, dead fingers of an undead being's hand wrapped themselves around her lower leg. "Well, no," she whispered under her breath while looking down at a reanimated Kaldorei corpse. "Watch out, little cat!" shouted Jaffron, then quickly turning back into his Bruin form and slamming down his powerful paw on the undead's arm. The reanimated Kaldorei's limb was completely torn off, but the corpse itself still stood up without hesitation, ready to attack. "No, Nyetha!" yelled Kalindra in a panic as a different undead Kaldorei lunged at her. "Don't you remember me?" she continued even after the reanimated night elf swung at her with his weapon. Luna quickly swept in and disarmed the mindless undead. But the fiend was not deterred as it prepared to attack Kalindra again, now with its bare hands. "Wake up, Kalindra! These undead are no longer our people," said Geridas, while commanding powerful roots from beneath the earth to entangle themselves around the undead soldier and hold him in place. The druid's words had no effect on Kalindra, though, as she continued to try to reason with the risen corpses of her brothers and sisters. The huntress was the youngest of the group, and so she had never been faced with such a horrific event, having to fight her friends and allies as reanimated monstrosities. "She is not listening to reason," said Dryadara, while transforming into a vicious nightsaber. "We have to protect her," added the druid, then jumping on a risen Kaldori's upper body and gripping it tightly with her front and rear paws. "Let's give our brethren the peace they deserve," she finished, and then with one powerful bite she crushed the undead's skull. "Elune, grant me your fury so that I may end your people's suffering," called Geridas to the heavens. Powerful blue and white light then seemed to briefly form the face of a Kaldorei woman in the skies above, which then shot down to the earth as a powerful beam of pure celestial energy and completely disintegrated one of the risen night elves. The surrounding undead were also torn apart by the beam's power. Jaffron mangled 2 more fiends to pieces before they could reach the terror-stricken Kalindra. And while the immediate surrounding area had been cleared, More risen Kaldore began to approach from the surrounding tree lines until the 4 night elves were completely surrounded. "There are so many of them," said Giridas solemnly. "This was more than one ambushed group," growled Draidara. "This was an extermination. We must end their torment. I will weaken them for us," added Giridas, as he brought his hands together above his head, and several green sparks were quickly emitted from them in rapid succession. As the risen Kaldore walked toward the group, several of the undead were distracted by odd, colourful mushrooms that suddenly sprouted beneath their feet. These fungi had various white spots scattered around the tops, glowed with a vibrant magical light, and while they were initially rather small, they rapidly began to grow. "Ooh!" grunted one of the undead night elves as it kneeled down to examine one of the strange wild mushrooms. The fiend then reached out in an attempt to grab this peculiar object that had inexplicably captured its attention. But before it made contact, the mushroom achieved critical mass and exploded, unleashing clouds of damaging green spores all around. As the other fungi exploded as well, all of the surrounding undead found themselves coated with the highly corrosive substance. "Now!" shouted Draidara, to which Jaffron unleashed a powerful stampeding roar. The 2 apex predators then unleashed their fury on the masses of risen Kaldorei. The feral druid was so fast and agile that she never even touched the ground as she jumped from target to target. The Night Saber would also occasionally launch herself from nearby trees to gain even more power as she shredded the fiends in her feral frenzy. "Unleash your wrath on me, brothers and sisters," growled Jaffron, while charging wildly through the crowds of undead.
Many fiends were torn apart in the powerful druid's wake,
but several others jumped on his back, attempting to pierce him with their weapons. Thick brambles, however, began to sprout from Jaffron's fur, making it all but impossible to seriously harm him. "Now, back to the earth!" he roared as sharp thorns thrust out from the brambles and impaled the undead that had climbed on top of him. The few remaining risen Kaldori were put down by Geridas from a distance, and once finished, he walked over to Kalindra, who was now regaining her composure. "Are you all right, Kalindra?" asked the druid, as he approached the huntress, who was now sitting on the ground. "I had never experienced," she began while wiping the tears from her cheeks. "No need to apologize," said Geridas while placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We've all been caught unaware by the Horde's foul ways at one point or another, and next time we face them, you will be more ready to handle their evil." "Yes," she answered quietly, as Luna snuggled up to her. "That's all of them," stated Jaffron as he emerged from the tree line and transformed back into his Kaldore form. "Are you two all right?" "Yes, Jaffron," answered Geridas. "We are well. Where is Draidara, brother?" "Strange," answered Jaffron. "She was right behind me when—" Just then, Draidara emerged from the tree line, still in her feral form and sniffing the ground vigorously. "We must make haste," she said as she returned to her Kaldore form. "Not all of our brethren were murdered. Several were taken as captives, and their scent leads south into Ashenvale. Well, this certainly breaks up the monotony, thought Iron Ghost as he looked through his rather large brass telescope at the murder scene far in the distance. Run by the goblins of the Steamweedle cartel, the town named Ratchet maintained a neutral stance towards any governing faction on Azeroth. This meant that all business was valid here, as long as the price was right, even if said business was seen as deplorable in the eyes of every kingdom on the globe. Because of this, though, Ratchet was accustomed to seeing all types of seedy activity, including murder. The town's guardians, or bruisers as they were called, always tried to keep such events to a minimum as they could deter paying customers, but the task often proved as feasible as herding cats. Let's see here. whispered Ironcoast to himself as he examined the 3 corpses laying underneath the Baron's rising sun. By now, the gruesome scene had been surrounded by several goblin bruisers, a couple of overseers, and a small group of townsfolk further away. Normally, Ironcoast would have no interest in 3 random corpses appearing on any given day in this port town. But these individuals were not inconsequential drunks or unfortunate adventurers. Word had spread quickly that morning. The bodies were of high-ranking Sylvanas loyalists. 2 assassins, 1 undead, 1 Cinderai, he continued as he inspected the corpses' clothing, equipment and regalia. And the 3rd seems to be a forsaken civilian, seen as the 3 dead look mostly intact. I'm guessing this happened within the last hour, or else the wildlife would have stripped the bodies clean. All killed with Forsaken-styled arrows, the orc said to himself as he continued his examination. So what Forsaken would go against Sylvanas' own forces, against his own queen? What's this? He said to himself as he caught a glimpse of a particularly interesting detail. The Blood Elf corpse is completely missing one of its calf muscles, as if one beast with a very powerful jaw took a single precision bite. Something like a hound. Having seen enough, the orc promptly put away his telescope and headed back towards town. Guessing that Forsaken Civilian was one of Ghost Ranger's traitors, thought Ironcoast as he jumped and slid down the mountainside. I just wish I'd had the chance to ask him about those 2 loyalists. Maybe keep one of them alive, temporarily. See if he knew where Dreadblade is hiding. He finished, as he made one final jump down to the area behind the Broken Keel Tavern, the town's inn. No point in dwelling on it now, though, he whispered to himself, while he dusted off his coat and walked towards the front of the building. I've got a rat to catch, and I've wasted too much time and resources to slip up now. I've paid enough coin, knocked enough heads, and suffered enough drunks, he added, as he climbed up a small hill overlooking the town's bay and port. All my intel indicates that I have just 1 more day to wait, said Ironcoast, while looking down at the many goblins carrying boxes to and from a docked ship, buying and selling all sorts of wares, and generally just being the odd little creatures that they were. The rat should be arriving tonight from Booty Bay, and that blasted rodent better have some real leads for me this time, or he'll be the next surprise this town wakes up to. The old Tauren had been walking since the sun rose that day. Slowly, steadily, and powerfully, he would set one hoof down, and then the next, one after another. With each thundering step, the reddish dust that coated the Stone Talon Mountains would be kicked up to form a small cloud. The sun was now fully blazing upon the rugged landscape, and the old shaman was feeling the fatigue. Still, he would not relent. His name was Achak Cloudweaver, and just days ago his granddaughter Hina Wolf had left his side to travel to their native lands of Mulgore. Her task was to be a relatively safe one, to reach a secluded rebel village and to retrieve essential supplies for her group. Achak, however, knew that danger lurked around every corner, especially in times like these. Because of this, he had embarked on this small yet arduous trip to look upon Hina's whereabouts and to ensure that she was still safe. Finally, Achak reached his destination, a small nook near the Windshear Crag, with enough elevation and with a good view over the lands to the south. The Tauren then sat down beneath the shade of a relatively tall pine tree and wiped the sweat from his brow. Achak wore a vest, kilt and gauntlets made of various quilted layers, reinforced by metallic mail patches, leather harnesses and fur lining. His shoulder pads were a combination of hardened leather and a mail cover, and from them several wood and metal rods protruded, which would help him channel the vast electrical powers he would often wield. On his head, he wore a leather headband adorned with a large blue gem in the front, 2 other smaller gems on each flank, and many eagle feathers that hung from the sides of his head. The leathers, furs, and feathers gave his armor a very rustic appearance, but some of his garments were very vibrant, as they were dyed in a majestic blue coloring, and on his back he carried a massive horned ceremonial totem, painted and decorated with Shuhalo imagery. "Spirits of my people," he began with his eyes shut once he had calmed his body, "grant me sight of our daughter, Haina Wolf Cloudweaver." After a few seconds, he opened his eyes, revealing the greyish irises within. The shaman was effectively blind, and yet thanks to his dominance over the elements and his relationship with the spirits, he was able to see far more than anyone else. Almost immediately, images of clouds, mountains, and trees began to fill his mind, as if he himself was flying above the lands to the south. "Where are you, Hina?" he thought, as the images started changing from red, rocky mountainous to the vibrant green, grassy fields of Mulgore. "This isn't right," he whispered to himself. "Why are all these soldiers?" The old Tauren's face was now clearly depicting the fear and panic he felt within as he saw the civilian village filled with many armored individuals. As Achak continued to see far into this area, his fears were confirmed. These were Sylvanus loyalists that had captured the camp. "No!" finally let out the shaman as he saw Hina kneeling on the floor with the rest of the horde defectors. All were tied together in one large group, and several soldiers watched over them. "Hold on, granddaughter," said Achak as he stood back up. "I will not leave you to the wolves." The floor and walls of the Broken Keel Tavern were all covered in dirt and grime. And to make matters worse, the Ratchet Inn's beds, tables, kitchen and bar were all packed into the single hall of the relatively small building. 2 torches provided a dim light for the many occupants of the inn, who found themselves within varying degrees of drunkenness under the building's tall arches. Everything that this town represented was magnified tenfold within the Broken Keel Tavern, especially at this hour, as the sun had just set. The drunks became louder, the thieves became bolder, and the violence became more brutal. "Roll the bones, you filthy scallywag," shouted a blonde dwarf, slamming his mug on the table. The drunken sailor wore a dirty black bandana, and underneath it his hair was heavily matted and tangled with pieces of dried seaweed. Ratchet welcomed all paying customers as long as they conducted their business in a civil manner. Everyone knew that stepping out of line was sure to attract the ire of the town's guards, as well as the painful impacts of their blunt weapons. This dwarf, however, was a member of the Blackwater Raiders, a highly respected pirate company, and an ally of the Steamweedle cartel. This fact probably granted the drunk sailor an excessive amount of confidence when addressing the individual in front of him. "You better watch your tone with me, dwarf," shot back the annoyed troll in front of him. "I be rollin' when I feel like it, man." The troll's hairstyle seemed to mirror the palm trees outside. He had a small bone inserted through his nose's septum, and he had a horde emblem tattooed on his shoulder. "You ready to lose again, dwarf?" he added, as those around the room looked on in anticipation. In addition, the nearby bruisers were keeping a close eye, as this game of craps had become exceedingly heated. Finally, after blowing on the pair of dice for good luck, the troll let the 2 small cubes fly. After bouncing and rolling across the table, the dice came to a rest, with the result being a 7. "You cheating bilge rat," shouted the furious dwarf after seeing the result. The troll immediately burst into laughter and began to wrap his arms around the large pile of coins. But before he could collect his winnings, the dwarf jumped across the table and decked him square in the jaw. "You dirty dwarf!" yelled the troll as he grabbed his cheek, and mayhem broke out in the tavern. The group of pirates backing the dwarf swarmed the troll and his friends, who in turn used chairs, mugs, and anything else they could grab to fight back. This was followed up by several bruisers, jumping into the crowd and slamming their clubs onto the heads of anyone involved in the brawl. Ha, what a show, thought Iron Ghost, who was sitting at the far end of the inn, sipping on a mug of Wiley's Wicked Ale, the local specialty. The orc had grown up in such environments, so the chaos he was witnessing actually made him feel right at home. As the fighting continued, a particular sound Iron Ghost had been waiting for was heard outside. A ship had just docked at the town port. "That's my cue," whispered Iron Ghost under his breath as he stood up. The orc then made his way past the brawling crowd, ducking and dodging any stray attack, while remaining inconspicuous to those around, until he reached the entrance of the tavern. From there he made his way down to just a few paces away from the port, and found cover behind a palm tree and some bushes. "Where are you, rat?" he thought as the ship's passengers began to make their way onto dry land. A couple of hobgoblins passed by, grunting as they carried several large boxes and bags. Then a group of goblins followed, screeching and hollering loudly about time and money, as they typically did, and behind them came even more travellers. An old female orc, with her sickly and odd-looking companion hiding under its cloak and hood. A group of weary humans, dwarfs and gnomes, all on high alert and often looking over their shoulders. A pair of Sindore, wearing excessively elegant robes, but no sign of the rat. Finally, though, after every other passenger had stepped off of the ship, a small, shady-looking figure jumped down. "There you are," said Iron Ghost, as he spotted the individual, who made his way off of the dock as quickly and inconspicuously as possible. The goblin's skin was an odd shade of green, most resembling the colour of the sludge found throughout the Swamp of Sorrows. His tricorn hat was black, his vest and trousers were dark brown, and the dark green iris of his eyes was surrounded by a sickly yellow sclera. "Finks, a.k.a. the rat."
What's up?
Said one of the goblin bankers as Finks carefully approached the bank, always monitoring those around him to ensure that he wasn't being followed. Iron Ghost, though, continued to watch from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to trap the goblin. After obtaining a large pouch from the banker and slinging it over his shoulder, Finks continued on his walk, now heading up the hill towards the inn. This was Iron Ghost's opportunity, as the orc had positioned himself behind a broken-down shredder at the side of the road. "Whumph!" let out Finks as Iron Ghost quickly gagged the goblin's mouth with his hand and rested his pistol's barrel on his back. "One sound and they'll be using your guts for shark bait," said Iron Ghost, while dragging the goblin uphill, away from the road and the dimly lit buildings. Finally, after pulling Finks to a relatively secluded location, the orc slammed the goblin against the trunk of a giant baobab tree. "I need you to talk, rat, and what you say better be real useful for me this time." "What do you mean, Iron?" responded Finks, while pushing back the powerful orc's hand as best as he could in order to breathe more freely.
You know I always give you the best intel.
"And at discount prices." "Don't play with me, rat," continued Iron Ghost, as he pressed the business end of his pistol against the side of the goblin's sweaty head. "I've only found dead ends and corpses with your leads, and not the corpses I'm looking for."
Where is Dreadblade?
Finished the exasperated orc, as his demeanour became more aggressive, and he wrapped his index finger around his weapon's trigger. "Hey, pal," responded the goblin, his voice now slightly trembling. "You don't want to do that. You fire that pistol, and the bruisers will come looking real quick. Or worse yet, they'll send that massive sea giant they hired recently. Last I checked, the town's guards had their hands full with a big brawl at the tavern," said Iron Ghost, now with a slight grin on his face. "Someone was using loaded dice in a game of craps. You know how messy that can get," continued the orc, as he kept his pistol pressed against Finks's temple with one hand, and pulled a pair of dice from one of his pockets with the other. Indeed, the town's bruisers were still dealing with the group of angry Blackwater raiders and confused Horde soldiers, who unknowingly had been playing with Iron Ghost's specially crafted trick dice. The orc had switched out the pair with a sleight of hand just before the game commenced, and he'd been remotely controlling the roll's outcomes the whole time. "Ha! Smart," said Finks, his goblin sensibilities having to appreciate the orc's trickery, even while in the situation he was in. "So it's time, Rat," said Ironcoast as he grabbed the goblin's collar once more and slammed him against the tree. "Spill the beans or I spill your brains. Where is Dreadblade?" Okay, Iron," yelped Finks. "Lower that firecracker of yours and I'll give you the juiciest tip I got, 50% off. I just found this out. I know exactly where Dreadblade will be tomorrow." Let out Ironcoast, while releasing the goblin and lowering his pistol. "I'm listening, Rat." "Well," said the goblin as he breathed a sigh of relief and became visibly more relaxed. "It seems a large group of civilian horde defectors had made camp over in northern Mulgore, near the Stone Talon Pass. Well, one of Orgrimmer's patrols spotted them and seized the camp." "Civilians?" asked Ironcoast, furrowing his brows at Finks. "What would Dreadblade want with civilians? Orgrimmar's forces will probably see to those prisoners." "Well, here's where it gets juicy," continued the goblin, while adjusting his vest. "It seems a while back a group of rebels, real hard noses, got away from Dreadblade and put a real beating on him and his crew as well. So the word is that Dreadblade has it in for those rebels real bad, and he's looking for any information he can get. I heard he'll be heading to the captured camp very soon, as he wants to interrogate the prisoners personally." "Mulgore," whispered Ironcoast to himself. "That's it," said Finks as he looked over at Ratchet. "And if you're lucky, you might be able to catch the Flight Master before he hits the sack. It'll probably cost you extra at this hour, but at least—" "Hey!" shouted the goblin as he turned back towards Ironcoast's direction, only to find that the orc had vanished without a trace. "Where'd you go, Iron? Hey! I said 50% off, not free!" All was quiet throughout the Alliance camp in northern Darkshore. The grey and serene coast was now completely covered by darkness, as the sun had disappeared behind the vast forests to the west just a few hours ago. The handful of individuals tasked with guard duty that night had been stationed at key locations on the perimeters of the camp. But the rest of the soldiers here were now fast asleep under the star-laden sky. One dwarf, however, lay wide awake on his makeshift bed in his tent. War had spread across Azeroth again, so Yolaf Stonecore had relished the combat that he had been thrust into. But the last couple of days had been too calm. Since the Alliance had taken back Orberdeen and northern Darkshore, the fighting had mostly stopped, replaced by constant, uneventful, repetitive guard duty. Thus, Yolaf had felt the resurgence of turmoil within his being, and he now lay in his sweat, body stretched out, while his head sat on top of his overlapped hands, and while his mind found no comfort. "Blasted reinforcements," the dwarf thought to himself while gritting his teeth. Commander Aldolf Odinforge had stated days ago that additional troops were on their way, and that with their arrival the Alliance would continue their push south. Those reinforcements, however, did not arrive, and rumour had spread that they were reassigned altogether. This meant that Stonecore's thirst for battle would not be sated any time soon. "Those night elves," he said as he remembered the group of Kaldori that pushed south after confronting the commander. "Aye, perhaps I can be convincing. Nay," Yolaf thought further, considering for a moment that maybe he too could be allowed to head south by Commander Odinforge, but quickly rejected that idea. He was a dwarf with no familial or racial stake in this land, so he'd never be allowed to break ranks and go off on his own. "It'd be best if I just forget about those night elves," he concluded. The minutes passed, however, and as hard as he tried, he couldn't help but feel slightly envious of the 4 Kaldori that headed south. He longed to partake in their freedom, in their vengeance over the Horde, and above all, in their violence. Finally, unable to lay idle any longer, the warrior stood up. Slowly and quietly, he equipped his armor. First his plate leggings, then his chest guard, and so on. Once he had fastened his helm's strap under his chin, he picked up his colossal great sword and swung it over his shoulder, strapping it to the harness on his back. "It's right peaceful," whispered the dwarf to himself as he slowly pushed open his tent's door. Good. Indeed, save for the breeze and the distant hoots of an owl, all was silent and all was still as the troops on guard were a fair distance away in their stations, and only a handful of dimly lit torches provided little illumination to the Alliance camp. The moment was perfect for Iolaf to make his escape and gain his freedom in the chaos to the south. Let out an exhausted soldier as Stonecore made his way towards the edge of the base. The dwarf welcomed the snores as they provided some cover for the occasional clinks and clanks his heavy armor would produce as he cautiously made his way through the unlit areas of the camp. Finally, after traversing only a few yards in what seemed like an eternity, he was now able to see the tree line. He knew the patrol schedules to perfection. He knew exactly where the night guards would be at this time, and so he was well aware that this was his moment. "Out for a moonlight stroll, are we?" someone suddenly said in a rough, powerful voice to Iolaf's left flank, as the dwarf had just made his first step towards freedom. Leaning against a parked night elf ballista stood Alexander Boltsworth. His large, powerful body relaxed as he gazed towards the southern forests. Iolaf said nothing to the sub-commander, but his stiffened posture spoke volumes. Let out the worgen after several seconds of tense silence. "You know, under different circumstances, I'd probably join you in heading south," continued Boltsworth as his gaze turned towards his own right hand, covered in fur and equipped with deadly, monstrous claws, "to shed the blood of those wretched horde, of those vile Forsaken, to have my revenge," said the Gilnean, as the memory of his enemies clearly ignited a spark of molten rage within his bestial eyes. "The tragedy, though," added Alexander while bringing his fury to heel, "is that I have responsibilities here. The commander needs my help. These soldiers need my protection, my shield. You, on the other hand, seem to have no such chains holding you back." Stonecore turned his head slightly, now meeting the worgen's gaze with his right eye. The dwarf had lost the use of his left eye in combat long ago, and in its place was a large scar, which was typically concealed by his long black hair. Iolaf stood in anticipation, unsure of what the sub-commander's decree would be. "I won't stop you," finally spoke up the Gilnean, to which the dwarf breathed a sigh of relief. "In fact, as far as anyone knows, I never saw you tonight," added Alexander. With those words, Iolaf continued his march into the southern tree line, disappearing from the worgen's view after a few seconds.
"Give 'em hell, dwarf,"